Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another video, and welcome to my November wrap-up. Today I'm going to be talking about the books that I read in November. So you have a double bill today of Books and Things because I am presumably going to put this up on the same day as one of my TBR Advent Calendar videos. Maybe I'll put this up like in the afternoon rather than the morning. But anyway, I thought I should wrap up what I read in November, which wasn't very much. I read 6 books in November, 2 of which I had started in October and read quite a chunk of in October, and one of them I actually finished off on like the 2nd of December, but we're going to include it here anyway. One of them was tiny, so I feel like I didn't read very much in November at all, but there we go. It does feel weird to be doing my November wrap-up now because I've read so much in the first few days of December. Like, I've read way more books in December so far than I did in the whole of November. But there we go, November just sort of passing by, and some of these books are a bit longer. So anyway, I will start off with some classics because I read a bunch of Victorian things in November, several of which were hangovers from October. So I finished off reading Shirley by Charlotte Bronte, which I was listening to on audiobook. This was a reread for me. This was the 3rd time I think I've read Shirley, and I didn't enjoy it as much this time. It's interesting. I love Charlotte Bronte, especially Jane Eyre, which is an all-time favourite and I've read very many times. But Villette and Shirley, both of them, the first time I read them, I really loved them. And Villette especially, the first time I read it, I loved it more than Jane Eyre. And then I read them both the 2nd time and really, really loved them. And then I read them both the 3rd time on audiobook and suddenly didn't like them as much. And I don't know if that is an audiobook thing or a rereading thing or a me not being in the mood for Charlotte Bronte thing. I don't know. But both Villette and Shirley have like dropped in my estimation on my most recent reread, and that's kind of sad because I do love Charlotte Bronte, so I don't know. But yeah, I struggled with Shirley a bit this time. So this is a novel not really about a woman called Shirley, it's mostly about a woman called Caroline, a young woman called Caroline who is kind of coming of age in the 1810s, in the Regency period, in the midst of the Luddite movement and the Napoleonic Wars. So it's a work of historical fiction, and Caroline is in love with her cousin Robert, who doesn't really seem to feel the same way about her, and she is lonely and depressed really, and about halfway through the book into her life comes someone called Shirley, a friend for Caroline, and Shirley kind of changes Caroline's life quite a lot. There are some bits of Shirley that I absolutely love. I think there are some truly incredible scenes, some really interesting moments. Everything about the Luddite movement and industrialisation is really, really interesting. There are some great characters, especially Robert Moore, I think is a really interesting character. Caroline I really like. Mrs. Pryor I really like. I think there's some really interesting things about friendship and unrequited love and unhappiness and depression. Caroline is, I would argue, depressed through quite a lot of this book, and I do think, as I think in Villette as well, I think Charlotte Bronte writes incredibly about depression and loneliness and sort of like a complete despair for the future. That's something that Caroline in Shirley and Lucy Snow in Villette both experience, and I think Charlotte Bronte captures it fantastically. But it is quite long and there are so many bits of it that I just kind of don't think you need. I feel like the pacing is very odd in Shirley. It takes us a very long time to get to Shirley, and I feel like every scene between Caroline and Shirley I'm very excited for, and then there's lots of random stuff about the curates and I'm just not that interested. And I do feel like that sort of uneven pacing is maybe like even more annoying on a reread because you're like waiting to get to the good bits that you remember, and because maybe in your mind after you've read a book you only remember the bits that you like. And so the bits that are less exciting, you're like, oh, I've forgotten that this was here and that this was not very interesting. I don't know. I also read it like on and off across October and half of November in a slightly scatty way. I don't think that helped. Whether it was Shirley or me, I don't know, but I didn't have the best of times with Shirley this time. Yeah. And it was interesting. I was listening to the audiobook of Shirley, part of it in October, at the same time that I was listening to Hester by Margaret Oliphant, and the 2 audiobooks were narrated by the same person, which I didn't mind, but made me sort of even more actively compare the writing style of Margaret Oliphant to Charlotte Bronte, and I just kept thinking like, oh, I just like Margaret Oliphant's writing style more, which feels like a very, you know, harsh thing to say to Charlotte Bronte, who I love and who got me into Victorian literature to begin with. But Yeah. Anyway, we don't need to talk more about Shirley. I feel like this should have been a more successful read, and I feel like it was mostly me. I did really love Shirley on my first read, and I loved it on my second, so who knows. Anyway. Then another Victorian book I started in October and finished off in November was The Vicar of Wrexhill by Frances Trollope, which was fascinating. I didn't like this book, but I found it historically fascinating. So The Vicar of Wrexhill is a very early Victorian social novel. You begin with a family, and the father passes away, and he makes a will, and he leaves all of the money to his wife rather than to his children, because it was her money to begin with and she was an heiress when they got married, which, you know, everyone is scandalised by to a foolish degree. But after the husband's death, the widow, who has been left all this money, falls kind of increasingly under the spell of the local Vicar of Wrexhill. And this vicar is very low church. In what manner exactly he is low church is a bit confusing, and I don't think I know enough about the history of religion to understand. He is within the Church of England. He's not nonconformist, but he is sometimes described as a Puritan, sometimes as a Calvinist, sometimes as an evangelical, and he has very, very different ideas about religious practice to grown-up children of the house, who are very high church. You kind of follow what happens as the widow falls increasingly under the spell of the Vicar of Wrexhill. And it was fascinating because I have read many a Victorian novel that deals with church politics. Anthony Trollope and Margaret Oliphant both like to write about church politics, and I find it really interesting. But I don't think I've ever read a Victorian book that writes about religion in this way. It is a vehement, angry book in which Frances Trollope paints all low church ministers as evil hypocrites. And the Vicar of Wrexhill as a character is just, he's so unbelievable. He's such a caricature that I just couldn't credit it. And there were so many bits in the book where I was like, but I just don't believe in this person at all. The book is very didactic and very prescriptive as well, which I didn't love. And it's also very, very concerned with theology, which I'm less interested in. I would say I'm very interested in church politics, but I'm not actually that interested in the ins and outs of particular forms of worship, I suppose, which there's quite a lot of in this book, which may interest some people more. And I think if you're interested in the history of religion, then it will be a really interesting book. But I just found it such an unbelievable story because the Vicar of Wrexhill just isn't believable at all as a person. It was interesting to read though, because it is very historically interesting. And also I kept thinking about the character of Obadiah Slope in Barchester Towers by Anthony Trollope, who's Frances Trollope's son. And Obadiah Slope is a fantastic character. And I feel like Obadiah Slope was Anthony Trollope reading his mother's book, The Vicar of Wrexhill, and being like, I don't believe that man, but I could write a version of him that would be real and would be believable and is human. And I think that's what Obadiah Slope is. And I kind of love that idea, so I kind of want to go and reread Barchester Towers now. But yes, this is the third book I've read by Frances Trollope, and this was definitely my least favourite by a very, very long way. I don't remember her other books being particularly didactic or message heavy, but this book is all about the message, and the message is all this particular school of religious thought is evil, which is historically interesting but not narratively interesting. So yeah, mixed feelings. Not a Victorian novel I would recommend necessarily, unless you have specific interests or something specifically you're looking for, but I am kind of glad I read it. Then sticking with Victorian literature, November's pick for Jen the Librarian's Thomas Hardy read-along was The Return of the Native, which I finished off on the 3rd of December, but I'm sure you'll forgive me for including it in this anyway. I really enjoyed The Return of the Native. I listened to the audiobook narrated by Alan Rickman, which I really enjoyed. Talking of Obadiah Slope, Alan Rickman plays him in the Barchester adaptation. But anyway, I really enjoyed the audiobook. I thought it was very well done, and I enjoyed rereading The Return of the Native, which I hadn't read for about 10 years. I feel like I didn't enjoy it quite as much as I was expecting to. I would still rank it in probably my top half of Thomas Hardy, definitely. But I feel like I was expecting it to swoop into the top 4, and I'm not sure it has. I mean, maybe it has, but I feel like I was expecting it to sort of rival in my mind Far From the Madding Crowd, Jude the Obscure, and The Woodlanders, which are my 3 favourite Hardys, and I'm not sure it does. But I also feel like all of my thoughts on all of my November books are not very positive, so I feel like I was just having a bit of a reading slump in November, which the TBR Advent Calendar definitely seems to have cured in December, so that's nice. Anyway, The Return of the Native is the story of several people who live on Egdon Heath, this sort of barren heath landscape, and there are 5 young people whose sort of romantic lives are very intertangled. We have Thomasine, who is in love with Wild Eve, who is maybe in love with Thomasine, but actually maybe is still in love with his old love, Eustace Savai, who is maybe still in love with him, but maybe fancies Clym Yearbright, who is the cousin of Thomasine. And then there's also Diggory Venn, who is in deep unrequited love with Thomasine, and Diggory Venn is the best. I love him. He's a fantastic character. Remains possibly my favourite character in Thomas Hardy. I loved every scene with him. And then there's also Mrs. Yearbright, Clym's mother, who's quite an important character. And I'd actually kind of forgotten quite a lot of her story, and I really like her. I thought she was a really interesting character. I think the narrative is fascinating, and the story is great and really powerful and really moving, and there's some fantastic bits. And I think it's a really clever, interesting novel, but it just didn't quite hit me as hard as I was expecting. But I do think, now that I'm talking through all my November reads in a not very enthusiastic way, I feel like maybe that was me, not The Return of the Native. So yeah, maybe I need to reread it again next year before I do a giant Thomas Hardy ranking once I finish rereading everything, or maybe I just need to reflect on it a bit more. Anyway, okay, before I move away from Victorian literature, there are 2 other Victorian books that I didn't finish in November that I will hopefully finish in December, that I read quite a chunk of in November. So one of them is Bleak House, which I'm currently about halfway through. I'm listening to the audiobook rather than this. I'm listening to an audiobook with 2 narrators, one for Esther's chapters and one for the third person chapters, which I really enjoy. And I'm doing a read along of this at the moment, so I will leave links down below if you want to find out more about that. But yeah, I'm really, really enjoying reading Bleak House again. I love Bleak House so much. I think it's so powerful and so clever, and there's so many interesting characters and plot threads. It is this big, huge, sweeping novel with lots of different characters and plot threads all kind of tied together by this court case in Chancery, this disputed will, Jarndyce and Jarndyce, and I love how that brings all the characters together. I love the narrative style and the dual narrative in Bleak House. I love the characters. I love Mr. George. I love Joe. Oh, Joe's story is just like one of the best things Dickens ever wrote. Esther's a really interesting character. I love Celesta Dedlock and Lady Dedlock, Mr. Bucket. I just, I'm not just going to list all the characters for you, but I could. But it's great, and I love it a lot, and it's really nice to reread it, and it's nice to read it with people, and a lot of people are really enjoying it too, so that's been really fun. And I also spent quite a lot of time in November reading Varney the Vampire by James Malcolm Ryder. I don't have my copy with me. It's in the kitchen by the kettle, because I often read a chapter while I'm brewing a cup of tea, and I'm not gonna go get it now because I've plugged my microphone in. But anyway, I have been reading Varney the Vampire on and off for about 2 years, and I'm really determined to finish it by the end of the year. I am definitely in the dramatic climax now. There's only 50 pages left. I am really enjoying it, but my physical edition is huge, and so I just never end up prioritizing it. But I have been quite enjoying reading a sort of chapter or 2 a day, and I should hopefully finish it by the end of the year. Anyway, moving out of the 19th century and into the 20th, in November I also read Mrs. McGinty's Dead by Agatha Christie, which was the next in the Poirot series. My husband Nick and I are listening to all of Poirot in order, and so we listened to Mrs. McGinty's Dead in November. I have actually already reviewed After the Funeral, which I've read in December after that, but anyway, that's fine. Mrs. McGinty's Dead was fine, is how I would describe it. It was a fine Agatha Christie, enjoyable, didn't have any huge problems with it, but it wasn't a standout Poirot. I feel like some of the Poirot series are top tier, top notch, fantastic mysteries, and some of them are just quite good. We know from the beginning that a woman has been killed, and that her lodger has been arrested. He's been tried, but the policeman who arrested him just isn't convinced that he did it. So he calls in Poirot to investigate, and Poirot looks into the woman who was murdered, who was a charwoman, and what she might have known about the people she worked for, and everything kind of goes on from there. Mrs. McGinty's Dead was enjoyable, but I would say if you want to read all of Poirot, then read it. But if you don't, it's not one to prioritise. I think we probably will finish all of Poirot like in the next year. Like we're quite nearly done. So maybe I'll do a ranking, like a tier ranking at the end. So you know which are like the top tier Poirots that you should definitely read and which ones are fine, because there are some of them that are just relatively skippable, and then there are some that are like supreme. So there we go. Okay, I have 2 more books to talk about before I finish this video. One is The Architect's Apprentice by Elif Shafak, which was the November pick for my historical fiction book club that I run over on Patreon. And this was an interesting read. It is set in 16th century Istanbul. It's a coming of age story, I suppose, of a young man called Jahan who arrives in Istanbul with a white elephant that is a gift for the Sultan, and he starts off as an elephant tamer but ends up becoming an apprentice to an architect, and we follow episodes in his life. I would say that I really enjoyed the writing and I found a lot of really interesting elements in this book, and I would definitely read more by Elif Shafak, but I feel like it wasn't precisely my kind of historical fiction. It's a very episodic novel that follows Jahan over a very long period of time, kind of dipping in and out of various events in his life with lots and lots of subplots, but like not a through plot. And I am a slightly more plot-driven reader who prefers a through plot. What it reminded me of actually was A Gentleman in Moscow by Amor Towles, which we read for the historical fiction book club earlier this year, last year, and I really didn't get on with A Gentleman in Moscow. I enjoyed this a lot more, but I feel like this is the same like category of historical fiction. It's that same kind of like following someone over the course of their life, dipping in and out of various themes and subplots and their relationship with various other characters, but like not having a central plot. So I enjoyed this, but it took me like quite a while to get through because it's a slightly more like meandering novel than is my primary taste. But I would definitely read more by Elif Shafak because I did enjoy the writing and there were some really powerful moments. And also, from everything I hear about Elif Shafak's writing, it sounds like all of her novels are quite different. So if anyone has any recommendations for where to go next with Elif Shafak and anything more like plot driven, then that would be really helpful to know. Then finally, I read a poetry collection in December. I read this. This is an anthology called Joy, chosen and edited by Deborah Almer. And this is a poetry collection published by the Poetry Pharmacy, I think they're called. Yeah. And so they create like collections around a certain emotion. So this is like a joyful poetry collection full of joyful poems. And I really, really enjoyed this. There were some really beautiful poems in here. I thought the poems were just expertly chosen. There were so many great poems. And I enjoyed it a lot. It's also separated into chapters. So there's like a chapter on like small miracles and a chapter on like joy in nature and that kind of thing. There was a mix of sort of classic and contemporary poetry, and I just really enjoyed this, so I'd highly recommend this. And yeah, definitely keen to read more from the Poetry Pharmacy in the future. So there we go, those are the books that I read in November. A bit of a mixed bag in November. I do feel like I was having a bit of a reading slump, but as I said, the TBR Advent Calendar in December seems to have entirely cured that, so that's very nice. Do let me know if you've read any of these books and what you thought of them, and I'll be back tomorrow with another bookish video.